Ludmilla refined her new formation over the course of the next few battles, at the same time starting the slow process of replacing her ghasts with skeleton warriors. Ahead of the company, Ludmilla sat astride her undead mount, sizing up a pair of blood-meat hulks that she wanted to replace a few of her undead beasts with. The Sorcerer King had turned her exercise into a challenge of sorts, going so far as to call it a game. For a new soldier to be dominated and added to her ranks, she had to capture it with her existing forces first. With the undead gradually becoming more powerful the deeper they went, Ludmilla found herself in a situation where she was more often than not faced with forces that were stronger than her own. As she carefully managed the growth of her company, Ludmilla could only marvel at how the Sorcerer King had turned an otherwise grueling trial into what she felt was an enjoyable experience with gratifying results. "It appears that you have a dilemma." "Yes, Your Majesty," she replied. "I think I have enough skeleton warriors to outpace their regeneration, but blood-meat hulks deal significant amounts of bludgeoning damage. With the skeleton warriors being mindless, they're going to be taking the full brunt of those attacks." She wasn't even sure if they could survive one good hit. If Ludmilla were still human, a single solid blow would have probably killed her or left her dying from having her organs crushed. The blood-meat hulks were also massive enough that a score of skeleton warriors could be smashed away with a single attack. "A poor matchup, I agree," the Sorcerer King nodded. "But it brings me to a point that I've been wanting to bring up. According to Shiltia, you appear to possess job class levels in something like a captain-type commander class with aristocratic roots. However, I've not noted the use of any active command skills since we started 2 days ago. I think I've heard the term before, but what exactly is a captain type?" The Sorcerer King seemed to pause in thought. Ludmilla looked down at the cracked earth beneath the hooves of her undead mount. With the amount of research she had done over the last half-year, she had gained some confidence that she was filling crucial gaps in her knowledge. Whenever His Majesty broached a fresh topic, however, she wanted to squirm in embarrassment over her ignorance. It was to the degree that she was making her sovereign stop to figure out how to explain things that sounded like he thought were common sense upon initial mention. "I've heard that you've done quite a bit of research on topics related to military matters." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Then you know how an army is loosely organized, yes?" The basic unit in any army was not an individual soldier, but a squad of them. These squads were led by sergeants, who answered to their officers. A squad led by a knight was known as a lance, but knighthoods were not often bestowed in Riestais. In Riestais, a noble's military strength was divided into 2 parts. The bulk of it was the levy, where a small percentage of tenant households took turns providing a healthy male of fighting age in accordance with their contract of tenure. The second part consisted of the armed retinues of the nobility, professional fighting forces that made up the core of a territory's fighting strength and served as the noble's bodyguard. The size of a noble's forces were dependent on the population of their territory. Of the 6 great nobles of Riestais, Marquis Reven and Marquis Bollope had powerful personal retinues. Margrave Uravana's capital hosted a military port with its stationed navy. In the forces raised by a marquis, many squads and lances combined to form the components of a company, which were led by the minor noble who was also their liege. Regiments consisted of multiple companies and were led by the major noble whom all the nobles and knights of that company were vassals of. Loose companies of minor nobles who were direct vassals of the marquis were also added to maintain uniform company sizes. The marquis had a personal bodyguard equivalent to a regiment and served as the overall commander of the territory's army. This was all on paper, of course. In practice, Riestais's military was both poorly trained and organized. Some nobles were dismissive of the need for high-quality retinues, confident that the sheer weight of numbers provided by the levy was sufficient. The vast majority of nobles were too poor to afford them. It was to the point that the annual skirmish with the Empire had to be financed by the crown. It was extremely rare for a noble to have a company of hardened frontier rangers like those fielded by House Saradnik, though the knights and personal bodyguards of powerful nobles were presumably just as strong or stronger. None of the other nobles stood and fought on the front lines with their men like members of her family did, as far as she knew. Like their perceptions of conflict and how they conducted themselves at the annual skirmish with the Empire, the nobles of Riestais mostly saw army organization as ceremonial. Officers were appointed according to aristocratic status and quantity was seen as strength. The armies of the Baharuth Empire and the slain theocracy were structurally similar, but they were composed entirely of well-trained professional soldiers. These soldiers rose through the ranks through personal merit, and officers had the experience required for their positions. In the empire, the general of each legion answered to the emperor, while the slain theocracy's generals were subordinate to a marshal. Those marshals in turn were subordinate to a grand marshal who oversaw the entire military and was a seated member of the theocracy High Council. Ludmilla nodded silently, and the Sorcerer King continued speaking. Much like how a fighter can focus on their swordplay and become a sword master, then a sword saint, or branch out into other specialized paths, commander classes have their own branches of advancement. In the Empire, I believe that legionnaires who distinguish themselves can rise to become sergeants. Sergeant is a job class that possesses the skills and abilities necessary to operate at that level of the army. They fight with their soldiers, issue localized commands, and manage the small number of people that they are responsible for. So this is the sort of commander that I am? Ludmilla asked. No, the Sorcerer King answered. A sergeant is a basic job class level, like a fighter or a wizard. It offers a sampling of how one may advance, and sergeants start leaning in one direction or another as they gain experience. One path leads to the commander job class, whose specialization lies in leading large numbers of soldiers from the rear. The commander job class leads to the general job class, which you may consider an upgrade to commander. If that's the case, she said, why is it that I've been classified as a captain type? The commander type job classes that you described seem to match what I've been doing with the Royal Army. It is due to your combat capabilities, the Sorcerer King told her. Commanders and generals have the basic strength of a fighter, but a commander type has nowhere near the personal combat potential of a captain. While commanders lead from the rear, captains lead their forces from the front. They are fully fledged frontline combatants, and this capability is already something you have demonstrated. Had she been doing everything wrong? The texts included in her reading did place sergeants as officers that fought with their soldiers, but every officer of a higher rank was described as leading from the rear. A dead commander was no good to the armies that they led, after all. What advantages do captain types hold over commander types? She asked. It seems infinitely more effective for a commander to focus on directing their troops from a place that offers superior battlefield awareness. That battlefield awareness is relative. A commander leading from the rear may indeed have a better advantage over a larger area, but one in the front is more aware and more responsive to the flow of battle in their vicinity. All commander classes have certain tactical and strategic skills, but captain types lean towards the tactical side of things. They possess powerful active command skills that affect a small area. Keep in mind that, in an army, you have commanders of all types. It's not as if you must choose one or the other. Commander types can be placed over several captain types, maximizing overall effectiveness. Ludmilla had heard stories describing this before. Tales wherein wise and cunning strategists led armies from a field headquarters while their powerful and charismatic lieutenants fought in the thick of epic battles to realize some crucial objective. When had she last listened to something like that? Probably years ago, from a bard invited to entertain a noble's luncheon or dinner in Irantal. Recently, she had been so focused on isolating the practical elements associated with her duties that such tales, which may or may not have been rooted in truth, had been left by the wayside. She did find them entertaining, however, much more so than tales revolving around fantastic adventures or courtly romance. The vast majority of people favored the captain types in those stories, who faced down dire threats and prevailed over impossible odds in a manner reminiscent of the heroes of legend. Was this the reason why Amelia and so many of the common folk saw her the way that they did? A valiant captain in the flesh, sprung from fantasies fueled by the tales of yore? You mentioned that both commander and captain types start as sergeants, she said. Does that mean I have sergeant job class levels as well? I don't believe that this is the case, the Sorcerer King replied. It is highly likely you have a special category of job class known as a prestige class. These prestige classes usually hold powerful advantages over basic job classes, but they require specific prerequisites to obtain. Usually, this means that one must invest in other job class levels before qualifying for the prize, so to speak. In your case, however, the prerequisites are cultural. The aristocratic roots you mentioned from before? Indeed, he nodded. Your noble birth and militant traditions are probably the qualifiers for this prestige class. It is said that all nobles were once this sort of noble in the past, due to the realities of their situation. These nobles of the past, and those such as yourself, do not rise through the ranks of an army, they are born and raised to lead their retinues into battle. It is a powerful advantage, as you have skipped straight to an advanced job class with all that such a start entails. Ludmilla wasn't sure what an advanced job class entailed, but the Sorcerer King stated that it was a good thing. The way he described how she obtained her job class levels also reflected the strange way by which Lady Sheltier and his other subordinates saw vocations. Everything was broken down into levels and prerequisites and different classes, scrutinized as if one could learn all that mattered about someone by doing so. I believe I understand what you've said thus far, Your Majesty, Ludmilla said. But I'm still as much in the dark as before about what you mentioned. What is the difference between an active command skill and what I've been using to augment the offensive power of my soldiers? I suppose we might need to use more concrete terminology. The skill that you've been using is an aura, a battlefield aura, to be precise. Auras can be activated and maintained at will. The active command skills that I mentioned are skills that deliver their effects on use and persist for a limited duration. Sheltier mentioned that you grasped one early on, using it to rouse one of your maids. We'll just call them commands from now on to avoid confusion. So the skill that I used to rouse Amelia when she fainted was a command. What about all these orders I've been issuing to my company this entire time? The Sorcerer King fell silent at her question, and the crimson points of his eyes winked out. Ah, I see, his eyes flared to life again. No, those are simply instructions. The skill you are using to issue those instructions is actually an anomaly that is at odds with what is known about captain-type classes. This ability to communicate over long distances with a large number of people should be a skill associated with commander types. It may have something to do with nobles needing to command forces from their territories, which are generally larger than what a regular captain commands. If a territory is populous enough, a noble may have forces larger than an army led by a general. Some other skills and abilities may have bled into your prestige class under the same rationale, so be aware of any possibilities that may come to mind when developing them. Never mind developing skills and abilities, Ludmilla was fairly certain that people were unaware that they even had the potential to use them. As noted when she and her friends first started exploring what was possible for nobles, it was likely that most unconsciously developed their skills and abilities throughout their rule and according to their style of leadership. Those who experienced their effects would attribute the skills as flavors of leadership, force of personality or weight of authority. Other job classes would similarly attribute what they developed to common sense. In that case, what are some examples of commands? Simple ones are not complicated. You might perceive them as orders imbued with the power of your job class. For instance, if your soldiers are too slow to evade an attack, a command can make it so that they can. Are they connected to martial arts in some way? Ludmilla asked. What you describe is similar to evasion, but in this case, one is conferring it to their subordinates rather than using it themselves. Commands improve performance, the Sorcerer King answered. While they can affect multiple subordinates, one cannot order them to do something they cannot do. You can use a command to help mages ignore interruptions and speed up the casting time of Fireball, but you cannot order one of these skeleton archers to cast Fireball. If that were possible, I'm certain someone, somewhere would have figured that out and conquered the world by now. Ludmilla turned her gaze to the undead company, trying to make sense of how one could turn any order into a performance-altering skill. With Amelia, she had done something like conferring her reassurance in order to fortify her mental state. Undead did not have a mental state to influence, however, they were immune to mind-affecting spells and abilities. She ordered several skeleton warriors to run around her formation. As they made their first lap, she barked out an order. Run. Their pace remained unchanged. After 5 more laps with no success, Ludmilla felt more than a bit embarrassed. Just to be sure, Your Majesty, she asked, this is possible, yes? Oh yes, the Sorcerer King answered. A brief boost to speed is fairly basic when it comes to commands. The skeleton warriors continued their tireless circuit around her company as Ludmilla reviewed the other times she had done something similar. Every instance she had successfully used her ability augmented voice was in civilian settings, such as helping Amelia to overcome her fear, compelling Liam to answer earnestly, or instilling a sense of importance to her words if she thought someone wasn't treating matters appropriately. They were all mental in nature, subtly influencing one's state of mind. What she was trying to do now was physical, ordering specific actions. One might have thought just do the same thing, but she couldn't sense any connection between the two. Perhaps it would be better to feel things out in combat? She nodded and ordered her single wraith forward to harass the pair of blood-meat hulks. The undead all around them reacted as well. A frown crossed her face as she watched a skeleton warrior in the melee take a hit. The hapless undead went flying and shattered on a pile of stone several meters away. It wasn't long until the wide, heavy swings of the blood-meat hulks cleared everything away. With only the two blood-meat hulks remaining, Ludmilla scowled at the scattered bones over the pile of stones. The skeleton warriors in her company would meet their end the same way if she couldn't figure out how to use commands. Lacking confidence in both her undead horse's ability to evade attacks and her ability to control it while fighting, she dismounted to dispatch one of the blood-meat hulks. She went back to the area in front of her company with the second one in tow. Ludmilla instructed one of her skeleton warriors to come forward. After evading another ponderous swing from the blood-meat hulk, she ordered it to attack. The skeleton warrior jabbed its blade into the left leg of its opponent, and the blood-meat hulk turned its attention to it once Ludmilla backed away. Dodge. The skeleton warrior was blasted away, and the blood-meat hulk came after her again. It wasn't as simple as conveying an order. She would need to grasp the timing of each combatant as one not directly involved in the fight. She recalled His Majesty's words about captains being in a better position to read and respond to the flow of battle. There was indeed no way that a general leading from the rear of an army could issue such precise local commands. They probably wouldn't even notice what was going on in a large-scale battle until something happened that affected entire regiments. Ludmilla called in the next skeleton warrior. The ghasts she had been using as light infantry had by now been completely replaced by them, meaning that she had 23 attempts left. She switched places with the fresh soldier. Dodge. The skeleton warrior was smashed into the ground. Next. Dodge. Her third skeleton warrior moved to avoid the strike, but it was too slow. She had a good feeling about number 4. It responded to instructions to dodge the blood-meat hulk and managed to avoid being obliterated. It hadn't moved any faster than it normally did, however. The skeleton warrior slashed at the knee of the blood-meat hulk, and Ludmilla prepared her next attempt. Dodge. This time, the skeleton warrior was too slow. A sweeping backhand smashed into its left side, sending it into the air. Why didn't you dodge? Ludmilla's shout echoed after the spray of shattered bones. She purposely avoided looking behind her, afraid of what the Sorcerer King and Lady Sheltier might say. A giant fist descended upon her, and she blocked the attack with the haft of her glaive. As His Majesty had described, a proper defense that resulted in no damage also meant that she did not budge from the blow that would have otherwise hammered her to the ground. Ludmilla forced the blood-meat hulk back and called in the next skeleton warrior. She sighed as she was left with another pile of bone fragments. It was going to take a while. This company is severely imbalanced. Though Ludmilla worried that her statement might be interpreted as a complaint, it was still a fact. After a dozen failures to capture the blood-meat hulk with her skeleton warriors, she killed it off herself and went to replenish her lost troops. Blood-meat hulks would replace her undead beasts as heavy infantry, if she could ever manage to capture one with her forces. Skeleton warriors replaced her ghast light infantry. Both were easy enough to find, but upgrades for her skeleton archers and skeleton mages were non-existent. The skeleton archers were a problem in particular. Their attacks barely scratched any of the stronger undead in the ruin. There were undead creatures that took the form of various animals purely formed from assorted bones. Many were greatly exaggerated in size, as was the case with the skeleton centipedes, skeleton spiders and other forms of skeletal vermin. They didn't seem to share much in common with their animal counterparts as undead beasts somewhat did, and they were too irregular in size and form to use properly in ranks. While this is supposed to be a learning experience for you, the Sorcerer King said, there isn't always a need for perfect balance. If it were the Sorceress Kingdom's forces, you'd have old guarders to use in the role of skirmishers at this level, but it doesn't seem like there are any equivalents here. Can the skeleton warriors be used as improvised skirmishers? They don't have bows, but there are pieces of rubble lying all over the place. I was wondering if you'd pick up on that. The Sorcerer King seemed to grin and pause. Ludmilla almost laughed politely at his pun before she snatched up her girlish desire to mindlessly please him and stuffed it back into the unspeakable depths from where it had come. Ahem, he cleared his throat. At any rate, low-level skeletons are weak and fragile relative to their living counterparts, and there's a 14-level difference between skeleton archers and skeleton warriors. A rock from the latter would do far more damage than an arrow from the former. Just don't expect them to throw them as far. She continued clearing the flattened city blocks, picking up more skeleton warriors along the way. Unlike the skeleton archers, they did not have quivers that produced endless arrows, so she had them pile stones on their round shields to carry them around. As they went, she realized that there was another sort of soldier available to her in sizable quantities, one she was already well accustomed to employing. May I add bone vultures to the company? Flying units, His Majesty fixed his gaze on a bone vulture perched atop a pile of rubble. Come to think of it, I know that the slain theocracy's forces summon angels, but I've not seen anyone from these northern human nations summon flying creatures for combat purposes. Are you familiar with their use? Yes, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. I employ them as aerial patrols in my domain. They keep rodents, vermin and birds away from the granaries, as well. I also have some experience with commanding them in battle. Is that so? Well, let's see what you can do, then. The bone vultures were easy enough to capture. Like the other low-level undead, they possessed a mindless intelligence that seemed to only consist of the rudimentary instincts required to function, as well as being able to understand their controller. If one considered the ecology of a negative energy environment, mindless undead was something like the low beasts and vermin of the living world. The primary difference was that they lacked empathy and had no mental state that could influence their behavior. After adding 24 bone vultures to her company, she dispatched a few to scout out the surroundings. When they returned, however, she realized that there was a crucial problem. I can issue directions to these bone vultures, Ludmilla said, but the bone vultures can't communicate with me beyond what gestures they can make. How did you communicate with them before? They didn't report to me, she replied. The elder liches managed them under my orders, initially. After that, 2 of my maids assumed oversight of our reconnaissance efforts once I needed the elder liches for other duties, but they worked with the vampire brides in my domain. I've formalized things since then. My maids continue directing the territory's security, while elder liches from the Royal Army serve as junior officers of sorts, communicating with our forces on the field while learning from my maids. The Sorcerer King paused at this, leaning towards her in the way that he did when something drew his interest. Ludmilla resisted the urge to shy away, turning her gaze to the side as she wrestled with the sensations rising within her. Your maids work with the undead? Yes, Your Majesty, Ludmilla swallowed. Back in the spring, the administration was especially keen on collecting information as to how undead labor could be employed in the Sorceress Kingdom. In addition to employing them in my territory's industries, I integrated them with my manor as well. My household retinue is a bit strange for a human noble. For every living member, there are 2 undead. Death Knights make up half of my footmen. I have an elder lich working as a steward for manor business, and there are 4 skeleton warriors to assist each maid shift with menial labor. They're especially helpful for 2 of my maids who are expecting. His Majesty's tone turned thoughtful. You mean to say that your maids direct skeleton warriors to do household chores, as to not overburden themselves? In the future, do they intend to keep their infant children in close proximity with the undead? They're well used to having them around already, she smiled slightly. There are many menial tasks that the undead cannot perform as well as my maids, so I suspect that they'll even have the skeletal laborers hold on to their babies while they see to those tasks. Our Death Knights wouldn't mind taking care of them, too, but the elder liches would probably run away. The success with undead labor in my manor led to the inclusion of 1 skeleton warrior for every tenant household in my domain. The Sorcerer King leaned back again, cradling his chin in hand. His slender finger slowly tapped his cheek. Ludmilla wondered what he was thinking about. What was their reception like? He asked. Broadly speaking, acceptance rates for undead labor are still fairly poor due to common perceptions and religious views of the undead. I may have been a bit forceful, she answered. Legally speaking, a contract of tenure is required for permanent residence anywhere in the Duchy of Erantal. Since the skeletal laborer is a part of my tenants' contracts, one cannot live in Warden's Vale without also having a skeletal laborer in their household. That being said, my tenants and their families became accustomed to their presence and use within a few weeks of their arrival. After a few months, they become inseparable. As with Laluvian and Willuvian, the maids that I mentioned, households with single mothers have especially become reliant on them. Raising a family takes a lot of energy, and doing it alone while also working is, Your Majesty? Ludmilla looked up at the Sorcerer King with a worried expression, as did Lady Sholtier. At some point during their discussion, his demeanor had changed. It's nothing, he said quietly. That my subjects have found appreciable value in my undead servitors pleases me, Miss Saradnik. Shall we continue our exploration? The Sorcerer King held out his arm, and one of the bone vultures Ludmilla had dispatched to scout the area descended to perch on his arm. After a moment, he nodded. It appears that they can report to me, he said. I suppose it's because they're technically my minions. Sholtier, can you communicate with this fellow? Lady Sholtier stepped closer. After a moment she furrowed her brow and shook her head. I can communicate with everyone at home and all of your summons, but not these ones. Is it because they're not one of ours? Most likely. A moment later, His Majesty seemed to come upon an idea. He leaned towards Ludmilla with a mischievous air. In that case, Miss Saradnik, he said, shall I be your elder lich? Ludmilla's mouth fell open as her thoughts instantly became a snarl over the various connotations of His Majesty's question. Her eyebrows rose sharply once her mind settled on his probable meaning. Absolutely not, Your Majesty. For the Sorcerer King to become the subordinate of a minor noble, please don't ever suggest such things, even in jest. It was purely from a practical perspective, the Sorcerer King straightened abruptly. In that case, what else have you used for reconnaissance? She sighed in relief over the fact that he did not insist on the role. If that had happened, Ludmilla did not know what would have become of her. We used shadow demons, at first, she said. Wraiths summoned by elder liches have also been employed in the past, but they're temporary in duration and impractical for an extended excursion like this. I believe shadow demons can be used here, the Sorcerer King said. They can fly and are stealthy enough to avoid notice by everything we've encountered so far. You'll be restricted to using them to gather information, of course. Of course, Your Majesty. Despite being able to fly, shadow demons were nowhere near as fast as some other flying creatures, such as frost dragons. It would take them roughly 6 hours to arrive from Uranthal. In the meantime, Ludmilla continued to clear everything in their path as they investigated the city. Judging from how the buildings had been destroyed, more substantial structures like the towers that dotted the plains should have survived somewhat intact. By going deeper into the ruins, she hoped to find something along the lines of a militia barracks or some other sturdily constructed government building. An hour later, those hopes were realized when a looming bastion of stone appeared out of the misty darkness. His Majesty looked up at the imposing structure. A castle? A garrison facility, I think, Ludmilla said. Even if their border defenses were sufficient against foreign threats, a city of this size still needs a large policing force. Whether the people here used militia or army regulars for the role, she wasn't certain. The state of the structure seemed promising, however. They followed the wide avenue around the 5-meter-tall walls of the building, clearing the area around it while looking for the main entrance. The avenue widened into a large plaza. A huge fountain occupied its center, filled with the dust that drifted on the winds. As they came closer, Ludmilla noted the base of what should have been a towering statue. The statue itself was missing. It looks like you have a mini-boss type encounter. The company stilled as Ludmilla halted her mount at the edge of the plaza. The Sorcerer King's use of adventurous-style terminology still threw her off. His Majesty always seemed so grand and regal, yet would often speak more commonly when it came to matters that adventurers might consider. Then again, he did declare himself a great adventurer and his accounts of the past also appeared to suggest this. Between the fountain and the garrison stood 6 blood-meat hulks. Before the new additions to her company, they would have been impossible to defeat, but now. It's time to finally upgrade my heavy infantry, she said. Oh, confident, aren't we? In response, Ludmilla raised her glaive, reordering her wing of bone vultures into 8 flights of 3. As they wheeled overhead, she directed 6 of the flights to dive upon the blood-meat hulks. Wicked talons drew deep furrows through undead flesh, and the blood-meat hulks moaned in unison. All around the plaza, undead converged on the disturbance, but the bone vultures had already regained altitude. Ludmilla studied the battlefield, taking note of any threats to them in the swarm of undead. Wraiths chased the bone vultures around, but their attacks were impotent against other undead. The poor-quality arrows from skeleton archers were similarly harmless, as even low-level skeletal undead had a small amount of physical damage reduction that could only be bypassed by bludgeoning attacks. A few skeleton mages joined the growing crowd, but they were out of spell range. The bone vultures perched on the rubble around the edge of the plaza were too far away to react to the ongoing fight. As her bone vultures wheeled overhead, the undead on the ground milled about in an attempt to chase them around. The blood-meat hulks acted as a fleshy grindstone, trampling the other undead into powder. That won't work so well against intelligent opponents, the Sorcerer King noted. Perhaps not in this fashion, Ludmilla replied, but it will happen. Armies are composed of formations, but formations are made up of individuals. The movement of an individual is restricted not just by the weight of their enemies, but the weight of the allied formation around them. These mindless undead might seem stupidly powerless being defeated by a tactic like this, but individual soldiers are just as easily crushed when the flow of battle goes against them. Furthermore, the morale of the living can be broken and armies will trample their own with no further prompting, unlike the undead. His Majesty nodded. I have witnessed this before, but from where did you learn this? As I understand it, House Zaradnik did not possess any large territorial armies that required such considerations. From beside him, Lady Shiltir smiled darkly. Ludmilla is a mistress of dread, Lord Ines, she said. Her tactical acumen is indeed remarkable, but what is truly delectable are the ways by which she rips her enemies apart. The opponents that are presented before her are currently undead, but it's easy to imagine what would have happened in the battles so far if they were of the living. The Sorcerer King looked out towards the blood-meat hulks as they continued to stomp around, then he turned to focus his gaze on her. So I've noticed, he said. But how is it that you've grown to become such a fearsome commander? I'm not sure if I would say I grew to become this way, Your Majesty, Ludmilla replied. It is simply the way that House Zaradnik fights. One could say that it comes naturally. Our place on the frontier puts us in a situation where a company less than half the size of this one is all that stands between the interior and the uncountable threats from beyond the border. Just as high morale can bolster armies far beyond the performance that is expected of them, low morale can shatter an army just as easily. Since we were always grossly outnumbered, it was always more effective to break the will of the many rather than raise the spirits of the few. With the rest of the undead out of the way, Ludmilla resumed her aerial assault on the blood-meat hulks. Her first move was to separate one of their number from the others. Now that the plaza was clear, there was plenty of room to work with. It didn't take long until she isolated her first target. One flight of bone vultures occupied each of the blood-meat hulks, leaving 2 flights to spare. As with her opening attack, the first flight of 3 bone vultures dove and scored raking blows over enemy flesh. They did not stay to continue attacking, however, instead using the momentum of their dive to speed away and regain altitude. The blood-meat hulk turned in a futile attempt at retaliation, and another flight came down to attack it from the other side. As one wing regained altitude, the second dove to attack their distracted target while the third readied their next approach. She couldn't exactly call it an advanced tactic, but it was effective and consistent. Over the next minute, the blood-meat hulk was shredded to ribbons, its regeneration unable to keep up with the ceaseless assault. The Sorcerer King stepped forward to dominate the twitching remains. I was surprised at the degree of control you had over that wraith, he said, but I now see you've had practice with flying creatures. While it might be the case with the Empire's aristocracy, aerial tactics are not something a noble of Riastais would know. Did you develop them recently or learn about them from somewhere? I did employ quite a few bone vultures in the spring, Ludmilla replied, but my appreciation for them at the time was more for their ability to keep an eye on my territory and move small loads through the air. I left them to their own devices when it came to combat until Dame Verilyn entered into my service. She is a master of aerial combat, particularly in ambush tactics and hit-and-run attacks. Dame Verilyn. The one she pushed down onto her bed, Lord Ines, Lady Shiltir offered. You'll have to tell me about that in detail one of these days, Ludmilla. Following her liege's contribution, His Majesty fell silent. The crimson points of his eyes wavered between focusing on Ludmilla and looking away. And nothing happened, my lady. Ludmilla protested against the innuendo. At any rate, Dame Verilyn is a frost dragon who I've learned much from. Just how large is your bed? Wait, you knighted a frost dragon? Yes, your majesty. She frowned at his incredulity. Was I in error? Not at all, the Sorcerer King replied. It's just that you appear to be full of surprises, Miss Saradnik. Offering a title to a dragon is not something human aristocrats would think of. If the Sorceress Kingdom has a dragon as a member of the gentry, does that mean we have an opportunity to improve relations with the Argland Confederation? Or His Majesty's words trailed off into what must have been grave matters of state. The Argland Confederation was a nation bordering the northwestern portion of Riestais, and it was presided over by a council that included 5 mighty dragon lords. Unwilling to interrupt his unfathomable thoughts, Ludmilla turned her attention back to the fight in the plaza. Without new directions, the bone vultures continued to circle out of reach of the remaining blood-meat hulks, holding them in their assigned positions. She called the freshly dominated blood-meat hulk to take its position in her company, then isolated the next. As more and more of her bone vultures were freed up to join in offensive operations, the less their regeneration could extend the time required to capture them. 15 minutes later, all 6 had become a part of her new heavy infantry line. Rather than stay to examine her new soldiers, Ludmilla made her way over to the fountain in the center of the plaza. She stepped over the edge and walked across the ancient layers of blown soil, her eyes fixed on the pedestal in the middle. The base of the broken-off statue remained, but there was no sign of the rest of it. What looked like the soles of a pair of weathered stone boots were left fixed there. So it really was humans that lived here. That was what appeared to be the case, at least. As long as the statue had been fashioned with lifelike accuracy, they were not the feet of a dwarf or an elf. Dwarves were squat and their posture reflected that, while elves were slender and balanced themselves more lightly than humans did. Her eyes traveled down the pedestal, looking for any script or image carved into the weathered marble. Halfway down, she clenched her fist as a wave of slow anger started to rise within her. What did you find? Ludmilla stepped aside, and the Sorcerer King came forward to examine what she had found. Why? The single word was all she could manage before she had to swallow her anger. Letters had been carved into the pedestal, but they were all defaced. What looked to be intricate carvings were also damaged beyond recognition. Her initial suspicions were correct. It was no natural disaster, no normal war waged. Someone wanted the society and people that had once existed in the Katza Plains erased from the annals of history. It was an injustice to the memory of the past, and the actions of the aggressors spoke of an injustice against the people who had once dwelled here. Ludmilla ordered her contingent to excavate the layers of dust from the fountain. Perhaps the remains of the statue were buried below. A name, a face, even a fragment of equipment rendered in marble. She wanted to find any hint of who these people were. They moved out of the fountain, watching the undead company work. Emotions are unreasonable, are they not? Your Majesty? With her anger receding, her response was nearly a sigh. Ludmilla looked over at the Sorcerer King, who swept his right arm over the surroundings. This is what it is, yes? The product of hatred. Or fear. Whoever did this hated this place so much that they wanted its very existence lost to the ages, its lands left barren and impossible to reclaim. Or perhaps they feared that someone might discover some unwanted truth. Which one do you think it is? Rather than answer her question, His Majesty posed another. Tell me, Miss Saradnik, why is the history of this region so unreliable? Unreliable? What does Your Majesty mean by this? One of my subordinates has noted that history may be placed under 3 broad categories, represented in written record, bardic tradition or folklore. This region of the world is no different in that regard. The Sorcerer King raised a pristine finger. First, there is the history that is agreed upon. For instance, no one refused the existence of the 8 greed kings who brought low the dragon lords of old. No one denies that the demon gods appeared to bring ruin 2 centuries ago. No one challenges the fact that the Baharuth Empire was once a part of Riestais, or that the Karnassus city-state alliance was originally a single, great nation. A second finger uncurled to join the first. Next, we have the history that is disagreed upon. Every nation in this region has its own version of events, and each insists that theirs is the true account. People argue over the membership of the 13 heroes, and whether there were only 13 of them. Like the Katsa Plains, who exactly occupied the greater region in the past is also a matter of debate. And the third? They are the histories that don't matter, the Sorcerer King replied. Or at least the histories that people believe do not matter. Yet 1,000 minor accounts of the past can be woven together into a grand tapestry. The truth, hidden in plain view. Ludmilla swallowed as he grandly topped off his list. Then has this subordinate already discovered the truth? She asked. They're still working on it, His Majesty answered, lowering his hand. If you have an interest in investigating the past, he wouldn't mind a helping hand. He is someone with whom you are already acquainted, I believe. I am? Indeed. I am referring to Moman of Darkness. His work as an adventurer was not only for the sake of helping the locals, but also to collect information related to his quarry. According to the rumors, Moman's true purpose was the pursuit of a pair of powerful vampires. He had chased them around the world, finally isolating and destroying one not far from Iranthal. But this history is centuries old, Ludmilla noted. Perhaps even older than that. Undead beings have unlimited lifespans, the Sorcerer King told her. The vampire that is his quarry may have traced her steps over this land 1,000 times before. A dozen lairs may exist in this region alone, and discovering them could lead him to her. He may not be researching the same particular topic, but he is collecting the same history. An exchange of information would be beneficial, no? Once I have something substantial to offer, she said, I will approach him on the matter. Thank you for letting me know about this, Your Majesty. With the blood-meat hulks set to the task, the fountain was emptied in short order. Unfortunately, there was no sign of the statue. Ludmilla scanned the rubble strewn about the plaza, but one piece was much like the next. A shame, the Sorcerer King said. Fragments of that statue being buried in the dirt might have provided us with some relatively undamaged remains. His Majesty turned to look up at the now cleared front of the garrison building. I suppose there will be a boss lurking in here somewhere. I'm still not entirely certain how Your Majesty can make these predictions. That's just how it is, no? As you've noted, environments like these are a reflection of what they were in life. Since this is a garrison building of some sort, there should at least be officers. I also assume that there will be a captain. If they get any stronger than what we've seen, Ludmilla said, shouldn't we start finding intelligent undead? That is my hope, the Sorcerer King said. I am most interested in the knowledge that such a being might possess. Of course, levels do not guarantee intelligence. There are plenty of mindless undead over level 20. Ludmilla positioned her company roughly 50 meters in front of the building's entrance. The wall to the right of the gate had collapsed, but she could see nothing immediately inside. She made her way to the stairs leading to the entrance. When nothing came out to greet her, she raised her hand to her mouth. Is anyone in? She called out. The sound of clattering bones over stone echoed out from the gate as a dozen skeleton warriors emerged from the garrison. She turned around and bolted back to her company. That's not what I meant. More skeleton warriors came out in response to her shout. As she sidled by her front rank of skirmishers, she ordered them to throw their rocks. The metallic clunks of stone striking metal shields sounded from behind her. Infantry, advance. Clear the way. After making her way to the rear of the company, Ludmilla turned around to observe the handiwork of her freshly fleshed-out formation. The rocks had not done much, though she could see a few skeleton warriors with broken legs pulling their way forward to the fight. The blood-meat hulks were doing as well against the skeleton warriors as they did with hers. Every massive swing destroyed one or two of them, and the dozens of skeleton warriors streaming out of the garrison were being rapidly thinned out. The sight of a blood-meat hulk suddenly losing a quarter of its health in her life essence sent a new wave of alarm through her. "Oh, I was wondering if they would appear," the Sorcerer King's voice drifted down from above. "It looks like there were officers in here, after all." Another chunk of health disappeared. The blood-meat hulk fell on its side, revealing what had amputated its leg. Ludmilla called out for one of the death priests to heal her fallen soldier as she tried to discern what it was. Visually, it was identical to a skeleton warrior, save for the deep crimson tint of its bones. She sensed that it was stronger than a blood-meat hulk, on par with a strong mithril rank adventurer. What she couldn't figure out was how it was doing so much damage. The red skeleton warrior's scimitar came across in a vicious arc, cleaving deeply into the blood-meat hulk's flesh. She ordered the two adjacent blood meat hulks to relieve the one that had fallen under the Red Skeleton's warrior's withering assault. Then she noticed two more coming out of the garrison. Ludmilla called down her bone vultures to intercept them, nodding as she saw that their resistance to slashing and piercing damage was resulting in significantly less damage. Unfortunately, this was also the case for the Red Skeleton warriors, who received little in return from the talons of the bone vultures. Still, it was an acceptable equilibrium. She ordered one of the death priests to manage the health of the bone vultures and turned her attention back to the Red Skeleton warrior making a mess out of her heavy infantry. Fortunately, the Red Skeleton warrior did not appear to hold any advantages aside from its increased general power and surprising offensive capability. It was taking big hits of its own, as it could not effectively defend against the three blood meat hulks pummeling it from all sides with bludgeoning attacks. Just as it was about to perish, the fight stopped. The Red Skeleton warrior crawled over to join her ranks. Ludmilla blinked in confusion until she realized that she had captured it. "I assume you wanted these?" "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you." She could make a study of them later. First, she had to get rid of the remaining two. A frown crossed her face when she noticed that the Death Priest's mana had gone down more than expected. Turning her attention to the fight, a loud, metallic crunch informed her of the cause. A Red Skeleton warrior had backhanded one of the bone vultures with its shield. The bone vulture flopped to the ground with a broken wing before being healed and flapping its way back into the air. They're using martial arts? It should have been impossible. Martial arts required extensive training, focus and presence of mind to enact. Mindless undead might be able to instinctively use what they manifested with, but they lacked the mind to enact martial arts. Another bone vulture was swatted to the ground, and Ludmilla ordered one diving to attack to crash into the offending skeleton warrior. Both of the undead tumbled to the ground. She called in three more bone vultures to pick up the skeleton warrior, and they carried it up through the mists. "Release it." A dozen seconds later, the Red Skeleton warrior smashed into the plaza, shattering into countless fragments. "See what I mean, Lord Ines?" Lady Shaltier's voice chimed lightly from somewhere above and behind. "Imagine if these were living beings, her enemies would break in no time witnessing this." Ludmilla frowned. It wasn't as if she intended to terrify her opponents. She was just using the ground as an improvised bludgeoning weapon. The next skeleton warrior was tackled and carried off. This time, she ordered it released from half the height. It survived with a third of its remaining health left, but was so broken that it couldn't get up. The Sorcerer King dominated it shortly after.